If you were never allowed sadness as a child, you didn't become strong, you became invisible. Your grief had nowhere to go, so it folded inward into your nervous system. And now, decades later, you might not recognize what happened because sadness was so thoroughly forbidden, you mistook its absence for resilience. But there's a specific pain that comes from this childhood, where emotions were managed by dismissal, where don't cry meant don't exist, where your authentic self was treated as a problem, not a child. This script is about what that does to you. Start here when you were young and something hurt. A friendship ended, a hope collapsed, someone you loved disappointed you. What happened when you tried to feel it? Did someone tell you it wasn't that bad? Did they redirect you toward logic, toward the bright side, toward people who had it worst? Did their discomfort with your sadness become more important than your need to express it? That wasn't neglect in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more insidious. It was the systematic message that your emotional reality was inconvenient. Your brain was designed to process emotion through expression. Sadness isn't a malfunction, it's a signal. When a child cries, the body is doing what it's supposed to do, releasing stress hormones, communicating need, moving through an experience. But when that natural process is interrupted repeatedly, something critical breaks. Your nervous system kept generating the signal, sadness, grief, disappointment, but the pathway to express it was sealed shut. So you learned adaptation, wiederverwendung, anderen Point 5, Point 5, der Innate of Z, where at samoleden. Some of you became obsessively attuned to other people's moods, reading rooms like a radar system, prioritizing everyone else's comfort over your own pain. Others developed a kind of emotional numbness, a distance from your own experience that felt like clarity but was actually dissociation. You learned to intellectualize everything to explain rather than feel, to transform sadness into productivity, into achievement, into success. No one could question. This is what therapists call emotional suppression, and it's not a character strength. It's a survival mechanism that made absolute sense when you were small and powerless. You needed to protect yourself. Conforming to the emotional rules of your environment was the only way to maintain connection, so you did it. Your psyche is actually quite sophisticated. It just prioritized safety over authenticity. But here's what happens in adulthood. You're in a relationship with someone who wants to know you, who says you can tell me anything, and you realize you can, not because they're unsafe, but because you've lost the ability to identify what you're feeling. You notice you don't cry at sad movies. You don't cry at losses that objectively hurt. You cry at inconvenient moments instead, small frustrations that trigger disproportionate rage or sudden breakdowns over things that feel minor. Your emotions come out sideways because the direct path was never developed, or you're successful. You built something you achieve, and in the moment of accomplishment, there's this hollow sensation where joy should be. The achievement becomes one more thing to intellectualize rather than feel. You collect accomplishments like other people collect experiences. You have a full life that feels fundamentally empty. Or you're sitting with a partner in a moment of vulnerability, and they're saying something difficult, something that requires you to meet them with your own truth, and you go completely blank, emotionally absent. There but not there. They feel it immediately. They feel the distance. And so begins the slow dissolution of intimacy, because connection requires both people to be present, and presence requires the ability to feel. The core paradox is this. You crave intimacy, but vulnerability feels dangerous. You want to be known, but being known means being felt. And feeling has always meant abandonment, so you create a version of yourself that's acceptable, that doesn't cry, that explains rather than breaks, and you present that version so consistently that eventually you forget who exists underneath. What gets suppressed doesn't disappear. It accumulates in your nervous system like sediment. Research in neuroscience has shown that chronic emotional suppression actually changes neural pathways. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that generates emotional signals, kept working overtime. But the connections to regions that could help you understand those signals grew weaker. You ended up with this disconnection between what you feel and what you can access. Emotions feel like they're happening to you rather than arising from within you. Many people who grew up this way develop something that looks like depression, but doesn't feel like grief. It feels like absence, chronic numbness, a low-level disconnection from everything, including things you're supposed to enjoy. You might also notice that anxiety became your primary emotional language. Not sadness, but worry. Constant low-level vigilance. Because worry sometimes got a response. Worry about whether you were good enough, whether you performed well enough, whether you were acceptable. That got attention. So anxiety became the emotion you're allowed to feel, and it's exhausting. Your relationships suffer because emotional reciprocity is impossible. When someone shares their vulnerability, you know intellectually that you should reciprocate, but you can access the emotional truth required to do it authentically. You end up performing intimacy instead of experiencing it. You say the right things, but something fundamental is missing. Partners feel it, they experience you as closed off, as unable to go deeper, and you feel like a failure because you can give what they need, not understanding that it's not about willingness, it's about access. The reframe that matters is this: that adaptation wasn't weakness, it was brilliance. Your psyche solved an impossible problem. You needed to survive in an environment where your authentic emotional self was unacceptable, so you created a version that could survive. That was remarkable resilience at the time. It kept you safe. It kept you connected to people you needed to stay connected to. And now it's the thing that's keeping you isolated. The sadness you were never allowed to feel didn't disappear. It accumulated. It's there in the nervous system, organized as tightness in your chest, as that feeling you can name, as the sense that you're watching your own life from behind glass. Recovery requires something counterintuitive. It requires permission. It requires a context, usually therapeutic, where sadness can finally exist without consequence, where vulnerability isn't met with dismissal but with acceptance. It requires rebuilding the connection between your body's signals and your emotional awareness, learning to notice where sadness lives in your physical experience, learning to name it, learning that grief doesn't destroy you, that crying doesn't make you weak. That authenticity, even the painful parts, is what creates actual connection rather than the hollow performance you've been maintaining. This isn't something you can think your way out of. You can understand it perfectly and still feel nothing. Recovery is nervous system reorganization. It's the gradual, repetitive experience of expressing emotion and surviving it, of being witnessed in your sadness and not abandoned, of learning that the catastrophe you were trained to expect doesn't actually happen. The child who was never allowed sadness learned a false lesson about their nature. You learned that your authentic self was too much, too broken, too unacceptable. That was the lie. What was actually true is that you were in an environment with limited emotional capacity, and you adapted brilliantly. That adaptation served you. Now it's just precision engineering on a prison you don't need to live in anymore. If this resonates, subscribe. There's more like this coming.